The Lost Colony 101 in less than 5 minutes. The Lost Colony is fiction. The idea that this English colony vanished without a trace was created by a play to sell tickets, and nobody ever said they were lost before that. You can look at the history books written prior to 1937 when the play came out, and they tell you in no ambiguous terms that the colony assimilated with the Croatoan on Hatteras Island, because they did. In the fiction version of history, the colony carved out the word Croatoan on a palisade, and when the governor, John White, returned with supplies, that's all that he found. And no one knows what this message means, so dun dun dun, they're lost. That's absolutely ridiculous. The colony had a Croatoan man on the ship with them named Manio, whom the English met in 1584 when they landed and lived on Croatoan for 6 weeks. He had been to England and returned in 1585, where he stayed with the English for another 14 months, then went to England again and was on his way back for a second time when he rode on the ship with the colony. This is a map by Governor John White, and as you can see, they clearly labeled Croatoan. They even give the latitude of the inlets. The English lived on Croatoan, as I said, in 1584 for 6 weeks. They also lived on Croatoan in 1585. It was the group of men under Edward Stafford living on Croatoan that spotted Francis Drake in 1586 and flagged him down by burning smoke. And Drake rescued all of the men that were here in 1585, including a group that was on Roanoke, and took them back to England. Now, the group that had been living on Roanoke under the direction of Ralph Lane had misbehaved. They murdered the chief of Dasacomonopo, which is Man's Harbor, under a flag of truce, shot him in the back twice, and cut his head off. They also burned down the village of Auguskocock near Mattamuskeet Lake. They were at war with the Secotan tribe. They also had managed to tick off everyone to the north, where the Mandawag tribe lived, and the Mandawag showered Ralph Lane and his men with arrows on the river. When Francis Drake picked up the 1585 voyage and took him back to England, the resupply for that voyage didn't know that. The resupply for that voyage came into Roanoke Island and left 15 men there to hold the fort. Now, the Secotan, who were still irritated and angry about their chief being murdered and the village being burned down, attacked these 15 men, burned the fort down, and killed 2 of them and chased the rest of them off. When the Lost Colony arrived in 1587, they came to pick up these 15 men and found the skeleton of one of them, the fort burned down, and the houses overgrown with melon, deer inside eating them. Then one of the colonists, his name was George Howe, was murdered. He was by himself crabbing, and the Secotan from Dasacomonopo shot him 16 times with arrows and bashed his head in. When this happened, Governor White sent 20 men, along with Manio and Edward Stafford, back to Croatoan, where they were to get news of these 15 men and ask if any of them had survived or who had killed them, who had killed George Howe, and just find out what was going on. The Croatoan hosted them to a feast, welcomed them back with loving arms, and said that they would talk to the Secotan for the English and try to make peace. Instead, the Croatoan went to Dasacomonopo, and when the Secotan saw the Croatoan coming, they were so afraid they fled and left the town abandoned. So the Croatoan sacked the town, stole all the corn, pumpkins, beans, squash, and food. And while they were doing that, the English arrived and saw them and nearly opened fire on them, but some of them called out Stafford by name. And through Manio, they communicated that what had happened, and they shared the food with the English. The English gave the Croatoan chief, Minatonan, a ride on a light horse, which is a small ship, over to Roanoke Island, where he witnessed the birth of Virginia Dare and Manio being baptized. The governor then left to go back to England. When he came back in 1590, 3 years later, he had instructed the colony to carve out the name of where they relocated to if they should leave, and they did. Now, it's never been a mystery where Croatoan was, considering the English had been going back and forth there for 3 years and lived there and Manio was from there. And even 20 of the lost colonists had already gone down there before the governor even left. Now, they were abandoned. In 1590, when they first got to Roanoke, before they'd seen the message of Croatoan, 7 of them drowned crossing the inlet, including the captain, Spicer. When this happened, there was a mutiny, and the crew didn't want to go any further. But Governor John White was able to convince them to try again, and they did, and they saw the message Croatoan, and it was agreed by everyone to go to Croatoan the next day. And they tried to, but they were hit by a hurricane, and the ship was damaged and lost their anchors, and that was the last straw. The crew had had enough, so they decided to go home. They ended up wrecking in Ireland. The governor, the last thing he said about it was that he was greatly joyful he had found a safe token of their safe being at Croatoan, which is the place where Manio was born. People at Island, their friends. He went on to say that their coming was only to renew the old love that was between them at the first and live amongst them as brethren and friends. So it's never been a mystery where Croatoan is or why the colony would go there. But the play and even schools somehow are pumping this idea that no one knows what this means. And the History Channel has even jumped on board and acted like it's an omen of death. And they ignore the relationship that the English and the Croatoan had. They ignore the relationship that the English and the Secotan had. They ignore basically all of the history. It would be like pretending you don't know how the Titanic sank and ignoring the iceberg and then coming up with all these theories about sabotage or whatever and making up, all kinds of nonsense of how that ship sank, when all you got to do is read the primary sources and it was an iceberg. If you read the primary sources, if you read John White, Ralph Lane, Arthur Barlow, all these men who were actually here, it's crystal clear what happened. But that's not the only evidence. The next written account of anyone coming to Hatteras Island is John Lawson. John Lawson found blue-eyed Indians wearing English clothes that told him that their ancestors were white people who could speak out of a book. They even mentioned Sir Walter Raleigh's ship by name. So there's that. But there's more evidence. We put some science to it. We found a piece of a 16th century rapier, which is this kind of sword. You see the big knuckle guard, the curved piece on the handle, and then the curved pieces coming up. That's what that is. There was a snap house gun lock, 16th century gun lock found there, writing slate, Nuremberg token, a fire bar, smelted copper, silver ring, Germanic stoneware, copper anglets, a Tudor rose, for God's sakes, olive jar, a piece of Saker cannonball, which John White, when he did arrive in 1590, found some leftover Saker shot on Roanoke Island, which we have now found on Hatteras Island. If you were looking for some rumored Nazi camp in the woods that supposedly happened on this hillside, and you found a Nazi gun and a Nazi dagger and a swastika, which is like the Tudor rose is about the most Elizabethan thing you could possibly find. That'd be like a swastika to a Nazi. You would not doubt that, yes, that is where they camped out. Well, this is the same thing. And it's just kind of ridiculous that we have so much evidence and it's just being ignored. And we know why. Marketing, money. Roanoke Island is afraid if this myth, this bubble was ever popped, that it might hurt their economy. I don't think it would. And it doesn't matter. The truth is what matters. And when you say you don't know what this word means, you just erased an entire group of people from history. A group of people who showed nothing but love and charity and played a major role in American history and adopted the colony are now swept under the rug and replaced with, this could be an omen of death. What a ridiculous notion. Come into the Lost Colony Museum in Buxton and see for yourself what we found.